Welcome back to another author chat. Today, I am chatting with Paisley Rose about two interconnected standalone novels, Level Up and Roleplay. I just finished Level Up and it was such a delight. I can't wait to read Roleplay. I'm so excited that Paisley was willing to jump on and chat more about these books. So let's jump right into the first question. What was your inspiration for Level Up?
So the inspiration for it was basically me giving myself permission to do whatever I wanted because I tried writing books before where I tried to think of what will other people want to read with the idea like I would want to get this published someday, and it was stressing me out. So I reached a point where I was just like, I'm not going to be a published author. I'm just going to write whatever I want. And I let myself be really self-indulgent with it, thinking no one's going to read this. So I added gaming stuff, video game stuff. I added other little interests that I have. I added really awkward, anxious characters that I thought no one would want to read about and stuff like that, that just sort of made it, I don't know, feel like me. It felt like the sort of thing I wanted to read. And then I let some people read it and they liked it. So but I'm trying to kind of use that mindset going forward is like, pretend no one's going to read it.
Yeah, I love that your perspective was that you were going to make it for yourself. And if other people happen to enjoy it, great, but you didn't set out to do it for other people. But in turn, I think that made an even better story, right? Because it did connect with other people that, the themes resonated with them. So
Yeah.
I think that's a really fun way to approach it. And you're right, if you try to write something that's going to be marketable, it doesn't have that same like joy and that same like connection to it. So in Level Up, there is a main video game that brings the characters together. It's an RPG called Stones of Ior. How did you come up with the idea for the video game?
So it was first and foremost inspired by Skyrim because that was my kind of first big RPG game. I wasn't really into gaming as a teenager. It wasn't until my 20s when Skyrim came out that I got into that. And it wasn't until pretty much a decade later that I got really into more games other than Skyrim. So for like 10 years, Skyrim was my one game. So that was a huge influence on this and this idea of like waiting 10 more years for another game to come out. But the actual game itself has influences from all sorts of fantasy RPGs that I've played with my partner since then. So Baldur's Gate, Dragon Age, anything like that. But the premise of the game itself, with the like magic stones that contain the power of a corrupt god, mostly kind of came from the title first, which is what I did for all the video games in the book. Is I sort of started with titles and then try to think of a premise that would go with it. So most of the games are cozy, so they have cozy premises, but this one was more like the fantasy RPG. So I kind of got to do a lot more world building, which didn't make it into the book even, but it was really fun to just sort of go off and invent this game that's never going to happen.
Yeah, I was so impressed at just the level of detail. It was very clear that you're familiar with the video game world, and I think that's a really fun way that you can drop an allusion to a game that you really love, and I'm sure that it'll resonate with people who do play Skyrim. I'm not super familiar, but I have watched some people play, but not enough that I picked up on that myself. As you just mentioned, there is a lot of world building that like didn't even like make it into the final story, especially with the video game. I'm wondering for the characters, is there any backstory for any of them that didn't make it into the final draft of the story?
So Damien's backstory kind of didn't really come into play that much. I had more backstory for him, not a lot, because he wasn't a point of view character in the book. But there is some background about him that I looked up in my notes to check that his parents didn't know he was streaming video games for a living. They thought he was doing something with his degree in software engineering. He does computer stuff. So they don't really care what he's doing, but they think he has a real job and is making money doing real work that they would approve of. And it never comes up in the book that they don't know that. And it doesn't seem to matter. So it's like either way, it's not really part of Audrey's story. And she's a very kind of introspective, self-focused person that if it doesn't affect her in any way, she's not going to bring it up in the book, right? So the fact that the reader doesn't know Damien's whole life backstory kind of makes sense because Audrey doesn't really care about that. She just likes him.
Yeah, and I appreciate in this choice is that like even though Audrey isn't directly mentioning it, it doesn't come up in conversation. Like it doesn't mean that that's not true, right? It's not like conflicting with what's going on in the story. It's just not necessarily explicitly mentioned. And without spoilers, I think that the payoff of the climax of the story even worked better because so many of the things were left up to reader interpretation. I think if those things had been explicitly mentioned along the way, it's not that it would have been bad, but I feel like the payoff was even stronger because it wasn't something that was necessarily like hitting the reader over the head with it, but it absolutely made all of that stuff make sense later when we learn the big reveal at the end. It's like, oh, of course that makes sense. So I think it's a neat way and a really smart choice to understand what's going on with the character, but not everything needs to be explicitly mentioned in the final draft. So then just a fun question that I love to ask every author, and I know that this is really hard, to choose within your own story, but what is your favorite part of Level Up?
My favorite part has to be the excerpt between chapters. So, in between every chapter, there's a game description that you would find on Steam, or Play-In is the platform they use for everything in this world. There's also reviews for the games. There's excerpts of like dialogue options from the games where you can choose one, two, three, four, and there's snippets of fan fiction for some of the characters from the games, which was really fun. So those were my favorite to write because I could just sort of sit down and just be silly and just knock out a whole bunch of them at once, and then I kind of figured out where to put them in later. And it felt really good to be creative in that way and just sort of make up these new games, make up people's opinions of these games, write really bad fan fiction. Some of it was really bad and it was so much fun. And I think that going back and reading it again, those are my favorite parts to read. And people mention it as being like a standout kind of element of the book.
Absolutely. It is something that stood out to me, and it really showed like a dedication to building this world. And what I love is, though, even this is a contemporary romance story that's taking place in kind of like our present day, it shows that there is still so much world building for these characters, this world, and doing that through the avenue of video games. And then not just the games, but fan fiction for the games and reviews of the games. Like, it really sold it for me. I definitely found myself enjoying those and looking forward to those at the beginning of each chapter. And it was nice that you could just have something like just be. It wasn't that, oh, this fan fiction is going to come back later in the novel. Like, it was just a little snippet. It was a ton of fun. I really enjoyed those and found myself laughing at a lot of the dialogue options. So that, I mean, that it absolutely stood out to me. And I'm glad to hear that it was like fun for you to write and, a way to be silly. And it was some much needed levity through some of the, not like darker parts of the story, but the more serious parts of the story. And it helped balance out the overall enjoyment of the book. Okay, we're getting into the tougher questions now. Okay, so digging into some of the deeper themes of this story, Level Up handles some nuanced themes of asexuality. What made you want to write a romance novel with a main character who is on a journey with their asexual identity?
So this one was really personal for me. So it's a lot of myself in it. It's not exactly my situation, but there was a lot of that, which goes back to the whole writing a book that I want to read. And I like reading romance books, and I like reading romance books with a bit of spice or a lot of spice, depending. This one's just a little bit, but I thought, just because somebody's on the asexuality spectrum doesn't necessarily mean they don't like that stuff in books or in real life. And I think there's sort of this misconception that asexual means you don't have sex, even though it's about attraction, not desire, right? So it's sort of Audrey's kind of coming to terms with that because she had this idea of asexual means you don't like sex, and in her experience that had been true. So for her to then realize, hey, well, maybe it depends on who it's with, maybe it depends on what sort of connection I have with that person, which maybe falls somewhere under the demisexual area, but she kind of specifically doesn't land on a single label at the end, which was kind of the point, is that labels can be helpful, but they can also be restrictive when you start thinking, well, this doesn't match up with the label I put on myself, so I should just ignore it or push it aside. And instead she's just sort of embracing all of her, whatever that may mean.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think it was a really great choice that we didn't feel like Audrey needed to have a specific label at the end of the story. It's enough that, she's figuring this out and exploring herself. And I think that this is a really interesting project to help push back against those notions for people who are less aware or, not familiar as much with the asexuality spectrums. You handled a lot of those kind of gray area themes really well. I know you just mentioned, spice in books, and this story has what I call, which is not a real term, but I've made it up. So, it has what I call purposeful spice, where the intimate scenes in the romance novel are central to the character's development because their journey involves being more comfortable with intimacy. So can you share more about your mindset and how you approach kind of the level of spice within Level Up?
So my intention going into the spice level of this book was that I wanted to have some, but I wanted it to be not necessarily sexy sex. So it wasn't meant to be exciting in that kind of way. It was meant to be funny and awkward and a little bit fumbling, a little bit exploring what feels good or whatever. Like she's learning all this stuff at the same time. He's learning what she feels comfortable with. And there are some really awkward moments. She hits her head on a bunk bed multiple times. Like it's really meant to be sort of show that it doesn't have to be like a ooh, this is so sexy kind of thing in real life. Like it can just be kind of funny and weird, but it's still enjoyable. So she's learning that it's something that she can enjoy even if she doesn't really get what sexy is.
Yeah, it was a ton of fun, and I'm sure many people will find it relatable. And that's one thing that in romance novels, there's obviously a huge spectrum of spice and awkward to like cinematic. And I think a lot of readers find that the, true to life experiences hit home in a different way and they're more relatable. And it can also make romance novels and spicy novels like more like welcoming to people because they're more likely to have a lived experience like this than, maybe the passionate throes of, a billionaire boss lover type thing. So that's what I really appreciated about this. It was intentional and every step of the way felt like it was serving the main story rather than just gratuitous, which is also okay. There's no hate on that, but it's really, I think an enjoyable experience for a lot of readers when it kind of all ties together. So then I know I asked your favorite part of the story, and now a harder question. What was the hardest part of writing Level Up?
Getting past the midpoint, that's sort of my struggle point for a lot of books. And up until I wrote this book, I hadn't made it past a midpoint. So when I reached that point, I kind of stopped for several months and I thought, I'm going to have to rewrite the whole thing. I'm going to have to come up with a new plot. I started outlining a new story where it was dual POV and they were going to like an influencer event and they were more of like rivals in real life as opposed to just in Audrey's head for 5 minutes. And then I was just like, no, this isn't what I like. This isn't the point of the story. The point of the story is this kind of like plotting journey through Audrey's understanding of herself. And so I think when I finally kind of clicked that, like, this is her book and it needs to be told in her way. So I think that kind of helped me get back on track and focus on what I actually wanted to do with the book.
Absolutely. I definitely, the middle point's tough, right? I feel like authors, when they're brainstorming, we have like the core of the idea, and maybe even we know how the story ends, right? We kind of see that main arc. There's a big difference between here and here. There's a lot of different ways that you can take the story. And I think it's really interesting that you explored like a completely different, like plot point with them being rivals and then being like or influencers in the industry. And sometimes going off that journey and going on that tangent reconfirms like, nope, that's not the right move. And, it can still be a helpful writing exercise. And then you ultimately feel more confident that like, yep, this is Audrey's story. In my own writing process, I didn't necessarily do a complete like midway rewrite, but I definitely had the story like ending in a different way. And I was like, this is not working. And I had to veer it back. And I felt a lot better about where it should end. But knowing the continuation of the story was still helpful for me because I'm like, okay, this is where these characters' journeys are going. We just need to see the end at this point in this kind of installment. So I'm glad that you were able to get back on track, but hopefully the writing exercise was still helpful in some way. So, given that, if you had to start the novel writing process from scratch all over again, but knowing what you know now, what's something you would do differently?
I probably would have plotted it out more at the beginning, which I actually don't know if that would have helped it because, like I said, when I went to replot the whole thing, it kind of went in a different direction. It had higher stakes and more drama, which wasn't really the point of the book. But now when I plot a new book, I kind of start with like a more of a structure and I outline every scene ahead of time. And so I know exactly what I'm going to write and it makes the process a lot faster. I get through that midpoint hump a lot easier. And I think that could have helped, but it maybe wouldn't have been the same story. I don't think I could write this book again. So I'm kind of glad that I wrote it when I was in this point where I thought, no one's going to read my books. I can do whatever I want. Because I actually thought that I didn't think I was going to publish. But now that I know I am writing to publish, I plan a bit more and I'm a bit more intentional with it for better or worse.
Yeah, I can totally relate. That's how my first manuscript went. I just wrote it for fun, was like, I don't know what's going to happen with this. And I wrote completely off vibes, had to do a lot of editing to get it to where it needed to be. And I'm working on my sequel now. And I haven't plotted it out nearly as much as you have, but I'm learning like that is what will get through that midpoint writing process. Like I still appreciate being able to write on vibes. And I think like fun ideas and meaningful ideas come from that. However, it is tough to get through the midpoint when you do not know how to get to the end of the story. So I think that level of detail is great as you know now at this point that you are going to be putting these out into the world and, making the process easier on yourself. kind of a fun one here. Who's your favorite character in Level Up and why?
So this is kind of a tough question and also an easy question, but it's tough in that there are so many side characters that I had so much fun with. Audrey's best friend, her mom and grandma, all these like kind of interesting characters in different ways. Damien's best friend Malcolm has to be my absolute favorite character because he's just so outgoing and funny and unapologetically weird and himself. And he's really like, you can tell he's like a kind hearted person, but he also kind of has no filter. He means well and he's kind of goofy, but sometimes, he screws up, which we'll see later. But I just thought like he's so different from me, whereas Audrey's very similar to me in a lot of ways, and he's like the opposite. And so I thought that was really fun to like write a character like that.
Yeah, Malcolm throws a lot of wrenches in a lot of scenes with him just being unapologetically who he is. And it's so fun that he can kind of serve as that like disruption and build tension in some ways. And yet, like, you're rooting for this guy. He is amazing and hilarious. And, you definitely want to see him on the page more. So I'm really excited that Malcolm will get more of a focus because we'll see the story from his perspective in role play. Did you always know that you would write another interconnected standalone novel focusing on a side couple, or did roleplay happen a little more organically?
Definitely kind of came out of the process of writing because, again, going into it, I thought, this is my one book I'm going to write that no one will read. And then when I started thinking, like, oh, maybe I could, like, I looked into self publishing and stuff like that. I was like, I could put this out there, but usually books have a series, like, it kind of helps them sell. And so I was like, well, who would I write about? If I were going to write a series, kind of, I don't know, who knows, I'm going to do that. And then Malcolm just stood out immediately. Like, I knew I had to see more of him and his life and like see what's going on underneath the surface. And so I was able to sprinkle in some like hints about what his story is going to be kind of retroactively once I knew that. But going into the first book, I had no idea it was going to be a series.
I see the groundwork that you laid in Level Up for role play, and I'm really excited. And I think, like you just mentioned, you're really excited to see what's beneath the surface with Malcolm. Like, we know that he's like a fun, outgoing person, and I'm really excited to see that interiority because oftentimes I feel like in romance we are not seeing the story from the most outgoing character's point of view. Sometimes we are, but not always. So, role play is coming out soon, and it's a male female romance that is 100% from the male POV, which is not something that we see a lot. So, what was your mindset going into writing this?
My mindset was just that this is Malcolm's book. It has to be from his point of view because it's his story about his journey. And I had considered a dual POV because it's more common, but the love interest, Evan, she kind of needs to be a bit of a mystery to the reader in the same way that she's a mystery to Malcolm, because there's things he didn't know about her and we learn them along the way. So it had to be only from his point of view. And it also shows how there's things he doesn't know about her, but there's also things he does know about her that she maybe doesn't even realize about herself. So it kind of gives us this like exterior perspective of her as a character. So there's the importance of being inside Malcolm's perspective and the importance of being not inside Evan's perspective that was really crucial to this book.
I love that because the series that I'm writing is from the male POV, and I approached it because I was like, well, what I enjoy about romance novels, especially the dual POV ones, is like the journey of watching the guy fall for the girl. And I was like, I'm sure that other romance readers are going to enjoy that. Like, they understand that that's kind of the point of this. And I'm excited to see how another author handles that. And I think you have a great point that like the love interest has to be kind of a mystery. And I'm obviously I haven't read role play yet, but I know that in mine, like I have similar things. I want to watch this guy figure it out. Does he rise to the challenge? Does he like do the right thing? Does he like work for the girl? The answer is yes. But like I want to see that, and you see him grapple with it. You see these guys like learn about the people that they care about and all of that, and like that's the mushy feeling. So I'm really excited to read it. I read Level Up before I knew that you were also writing a male POV romance, but I'm like even more excited. I can't wait. So to wrap us up here, what are you most excited for readers to experience in your upcoming novel roleplay?
Well, of course, I'm excited for people to meet Malcolm, or I guess meet Malcolm for the first time if you haven't read Level Up, or get to know him better if you have read it, and sort of see maybe another side of him, or maybe see that, he really is just as fun-loving as he comes across, but obviously people are more nuanced than that. And so I'm hoping that comes across so you can see the way that he isn't necessarily performing his outgoing nature as like an act that's completely fake, but at the same time, there's more going on. And it was really fun to explore that. I'm really excited for people to see it and also to meet some of the other characters that are in this world that we didn't meet in the first book, but who might have their own books coming in the future. So it's kind of like expanding this universe.
Well, thank you so much for taking time to chat with me. I'm really excited to read Roleplay, which comes out February 13th. If you are interested in reading Roleplay, go find it on Amazon. And I've also linked Paisley's Blue Sky and website down in the description below. So stay tuned. And if you haven't read Level Up, you absolutely need to. It was great. Read both of them, I think, is the answer here. But hopefully you enjoyed learning more about these interconnected standalone novels. Thank you, Paisley, for jumping on and chatting with me today.
Thanks for inviting me.